August 15, 1945, San Francisco Harbor. 37 Japanese women stepped off a transport ship expecting execution. What happened in the next 47 seconds would become the story Japan told for generations about why America is different. The fog that morning was thick as cotton rolling off the Pacific in gray waves that swallowed sound. Through that fog came the USS transport ship, its engines rumbling low and ominous, carrying cargo that would test everything America claimed to believe about itself. In the hold below deck, 37 women sat in darkness, listening to those engines slow, feeling the ship lurch as it docked. For 3 weeks, they had sailed eastward from the ruins of Saipan, away from everything they knew toward a land they had been taught to fear more than death itself. These were not soldiers. They were secretaries, translators, nurses, radio operators who had served the Japanese imperial forces across the Pacific Islands. Some had volunteered, drawn by promises of good wages and patriotic duty. Others had been conscripted, given no choice but to serve. Now, with Emperor Hirohito's surrender still ringing in their ears, they were prisoners of war being delivered into American hands. The youngest was barely 19. Her name was Yuki Matsuda, and she had worked as a typist in a military office in Manila. She sat now with her knees pulled to her chest, clutching a photograph of her mother, the only possession she had managed to keep through the chaos of capture. The photograph was creased and worn, the image fading, but she held it like a talisman against what was coming. The oldest was 42. Fumiko Sato had been a head nurse at a field hospital in Okinawa for 8 years. She had seen more death than any human should witness. She had lost her own son, Takeshi, aged 20, in the battle for Manila just 3 months before her capture. She had sewn his name into the hem of her uniform, the only memorial she could carry. Her hands, once steady enough to suture arteries under artillery fire, now trembled slightly as the ship's engines cut to idle. Among them sat Aiko Nakamura, 35 years old, a school teacher from Tokyo who had been conscripted to work as a radio operator on Saipan. She had lost both her children in the firebombing of Tokyo in March, her husband missing and presumed dead. The bitterness had settled into her bones like ice. She had nothing left to lose, which made her the most dangerous kind of prisoner. The kind who had already decided death was preferable to whatever humiliation the Americans would inflict. Between them sat 34 other women teachers and clerks and telephone operators, women who had worn uniforms and served tea and filed papers and believed because they had been told to believe that they were helping their nation achieve its destiny. Their clothes were filthy, stained with 3 weeks of salt water and sweat. Their hair, once carefully pinned and neat, now hung in tangles. Many had lost weight during the journey, subsisting on thin rice gruel and stale bread. Some had fallen ill. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the metal walls, wondering if they would ever see Japan again, or if they even wanted to. When the engines finally stopped and the ship lurched against the dock, fear rippled through the hold like electricity. Through the narrow portholes, they could see the edges of a harbor, buildings rising tall and undamaged against a gray sky. This was San Francisco. This was America. This was where the monsters lived. Among them sat Reiko Tanaka, 28 years old, fluent in English, a translator who had worked for the Imperial Navy's Communications Division. She had been the brave one during the voyage, or at least the one who pretended to be. She had translated the few words the American sailors had spoken to them, had tried to keep spirits up, had organized the women into groups for meager rations. But Reiko carried a secret, a pain that had been growing in her abdomen for days, sharp and insistent. She had ignored it, thinking it was stress or hunger, or the remnants of an illness she had caught on Saipan. The wound had happened 3 weeks ago during the final chaotic days before the island fell. Shrapnel from an artillery shell, a piece of metal that had torn through her side and been hastily bandaged by a field medic who had no proper supplies. Now standing still after weeks of movement, the pain flared hot and urgent. The smell hit them first when the cargo doors opened. Not smoke or death or the rot they had grown used to on the islands. Instead, it was salt air mixed with something cleaner, sharper. Coffee, diesel fuel wet, wood-fresh paint. To women who had spent months in the acrid stench of war, the smell was almost painful in its normalcy. The sound followed, a cacophony of English voices shouting orders, machinery clanking, seagulls crying overhead. To women who had spent months in silence or whispers, the noise was overwhelming. Light poured into the hold, blinding after weeks of dimness. An American sailor appeared in the doorway, young and sunburned, holding a clipboard. He looked nervous. Behind him stood 2 military policemen with rifles slung over their shoulders, not pointing at anyone, just there waiting. All right, ladies, let's go. Single file slowly now. The words meant nothing to most of them. Only Reiko and a few others spoke English. But the gesture was clear. They were to climb up, step, outface whatever waited on the other side. Reiko went first. She had always been first. She climbed the metal stairs on shaking legs, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her temples, in the wound at her side that pulsed with each step. The dock stretched before them, dewy and solid, lined with warehouses and cranes. American soldiers stood in loose formations watching. Some looked curious, others bored. A few seemed almost sympathetic. None looked like the demons they had been warned about. Behind Reiko, the other women emerged one by one, blinking in the daylight, gripping small bags that held their only possessions. Yuki clutched her photograph. Fumiko carried medical texts she had refused to abandon. Aiko held nothing, her hands empty, her face a mask of cold defiance. These small things, these fragments of their old lives, were all they had left. They stood in a line on the dock, 37 women in stained uniforms, waiting for the violence they had been promised. For months, propaganda had filled their heads with images of American brutality. They would be tortured, violated, killed, or worse. Their officers had warned them. The newspapers had confirmed it. Every broadcast from Tokyo had repeated the same message. Surrender to the Americans meant a fate worse than death. Better to die honorably than face capture. But now, standing in the August sun, watching American soldiers mill about with cigarettes and coffee cups, the women felt their certainty crack. Where was the violence? Where were the chains? Instead, there was paperwork. A medical officer approached, a stethoscope around his neck and a kind, tired face. Captain Robert Hayes was 45 years old, a surgeon from Massachusetts who had spent the last 3 years in field hospitals from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. He had sewn up more shattered bodies than he cared to count. He had held dying boys in his arms and lied to them about their chances. He had learned to function on 2 hours of sleep and coffee that tasted like motor oil. He had also learned something else in those 3 years. He had learned that the face of suffering looked the same in every language. An older woman in a Red Cross uniform stood beside him, carrying a clipboard. She smiled at the Japanese women. Actually smiled. Reiko felt dizzy, not from fear but from confusion, and from something else. That pain in her abdomen flaring now sharp and insistent and wet. She looked down. Her dress, a simple gray garment she had worn throughout the journey, was darkening at the hem. Not with water, with blood. Fresh red blood seeping through the fabric, running down her legs, pooling at her feet. The world tilted. She tried to speak, to call for help, but her voice came out as a whisper. I'm bleeding through my dress. The woman next to her, Yuki, turned and gasped. The sound was loud enough to draw attention. Reiko's legs gave out. She collapsed forward, her body hitting the wooden dock with a sickening thud. The other women screamed. Some tried to run. Others froze, certain this was it, the beginning of the massacre they had feared. American soldiers would now descend on them, finish what had started, punish them for being Japanese, for losing the war, for existing. But what happened next changed everything. 2 medics sprinted across the dock, their boots pounding against the wood. Behind them came a stretcher, carried by 2 more soldiers. Captain Hayes dropped his clipboard and ran, his face tight with professional concern. Not rage, not cruelty, concern. Make room, everyone, back. The shouts were in English, but the meaning was clear from the gestures. The women scattered, some still crying, others frozen in shock. Yuki stood over Reiko's body, unable to control the fear that made her whole body shake. She was certain this was the moment. They would hurt Reiko now. Finish her. Make an example. Miss, we need to help her. Please step aside. The medic's voice was gentle but firm. He knelt beside Reiko, his hands already reaching for her wrist to check for a pulse. Corporal James Walsh was 22 years old, from a farm outside Des Moines, Iowa. He had joined the army at 18, fought at Iwo Jima, watched his best friend die from a Japanese sniper's bullet on the black sand beaches. He had every reason to hate the woman bleeding on the dock in front of him. But when he saw Reiko's pale face, her blood spreading across the weathered wood, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a patient. He saw someone dying. This is what separates us from them, Walsh thought as his hands moved with practiced efficiency. We choose to save, not destroy. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Another medic cut away the fabric of her dress with scissors, exposing the source of the bleeding. An old wound infected and reopened, probably from shrapnel, or an untreated injury sustained weeks ago during the chaos of Saipan's fall. The infection had spread, turning the flesh around it green and swollen. Sepsis, Walsh thought. She's septic. Without antibiotics, she'll be dead in 48 hours. Yuki didn't move. She couldn't understand the English words, but she understood the hands reaching for her friend. This was it. They were going to hurt her, finish her. She had seen enough death to know what came next. But then the impossible happened. Captain Hayes looked up at Yuki and smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking one, a reassuring smile, the kind a father might give a frightened child. It's okay, he said, slowly pointing to the red cross on his armband. We help. We help her. Understand. Help, he gestured to his medical bag, pulling out bandages, bottles of clear liquid metal instruments that gleamed in the sunlight. Then he did something that made Yuki's breath catch. He gently touched Reiko's forehead, checking for fever. His movements were careful, practiced. There was no violence in his touch, no anger. He was treating her like a patient, not an enemy. The other women watched in stunned silence as the medics worked. They cleaned the wound, applied antiseptic that made Reiko moan even in unconsciousness, wrapped fresh, white bandages around her abdomen. Walsh started an intravenous drip, hanging a bag of clear fluid from a metal stand someone had rushed over. Hayes administered a shot, probably morphine for the pain, definitely penicillin to fight infection. Within minutes, Reiko was on a stretcher being carried toward an ambulance that had pulled up to the dock. The back doors stood open, revealing a clean interior with a real medical bed, oxygen tanks, supplies arranged neatly on shelves. It looked nothing like the makeshift aid stations they had seen during the war, where wounded soldiers lay on dirt floors with barely enough bandages to go around. Hayes turned to the remaining women and spoke to a translator who had appeared, a Japanese-American soldier who looked almost as uncomfortable as the prisoners. Sergeant Ken Yamada was 25 years old, born in Los Angeles, raised speaking both English and Japanese. His family had spent 3 years in an internment camp in California while he fought with the 442nd Regiment in Europe. He understood displacement, understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy in your own country. Tell them she's going to be fine, Hayes said. We're taking her to Letterman Army Hospital. She'll receive proper care. The rest of you will be examined as well, but there's nothing to fear. We treat prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. Yamada translated, his voice shaking slightly. The women listened, their faces a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Geneva Convention. Proper care. These were words they had heard before, but only in the context of lies they thought Americans told to trick prisoners. Now they had just watched those words become actions. As the ambulance pulled away, siren-wailing Fumiko, the older nurse, spoke for the first time since they had landed. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence that had fallen over the group, everyone heard her. They saved her. The Americans saved her. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact that seemed to defy everything she had believed about the world. Aiko said nothing, but her jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as she watched the ambulance disappear into the fog. She did not trust this. Could not trust this. It was a trick. It had to be. 400 miles away in a command tent at the POW processing facility that would become their temporary home, Colonel Richard Patterson sat reviewing protocols with his staff. He was 53 years old, a career officer who had seen action in the First World War and spent this war managing logistics and prisoner operations. He was tired, ready to go home to his wife in Virginia, ready to stop making decisions about life and death. But he had one more job to do. The men assembled before him represented the full spectrum of American military experience. Some had fought in the Pacific, watching friends die on beaches with Japanese names. Others had served stateside, hearing stories that made the enemy seem less than human. All of them were about to face a test that had nothing to do with combat. Gentlemen, Patterson said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of service, we're about to receive 37 Japanese women. Civilians mostly. They've been through hell. Some of you have been through hell fighting their countrymen. I know that. I know what the Japanese did to our boys. I know about Bataan. I know about the Burma Railway. I know some of you lost friends, brothers, sons. He paused. Let that sink in. Let them feel the weight of their losses, their anger, their justified rage. Private Joseph Dixon sat in the back, jaw clenched, thinking about his brother Jimmy, who had died at Saipan, the same place these women had been captured. Dixon wanted to hate them. Part of him thought he should hate them. Beside him sat Sergeant Robert Miller, 20 years old, despite his rank promoted early after showing exceptional leadership at Okinawa. Miller had lost his older brother David at Saipan too. David had been his hero, his protector, the reason Miller had joined up in the first place. The rage that had carried him through combat still simmered just below his surface. But here's what separates us from every empire in history. Patterson continued, his voice rising with conviction. We don't become our enemy. We don't abandon our values when it's hard. We follow the Geneva Convention, not because they didn't, but because we are Americans. That means something. It means when we win the right way. And when history looks back, they'll see that America had the power to take revenge, but chose mercy instead. That's the victory that lasts. The silence that followed was heavy. Not everyone agreed. Patterson could see it in their faces, in the way Dixon's hands clenched into fists, in the way Miller stared at the ground, jaw working. I know some of you are thinking this is wrong, Patterson said quietly, that we're being too soft, that these people don't deserve our kindness. And you know what? You're entitled to feel that way. Your losses are real. Your anger is justified. But I'm asking you, ordering you to be better than that anger, to show these women what America really means. Can you do that? Dixon said nothing. Miller said nothing. But they both nodded, barely, because orders were orders. Outside the tent, Corporal Walsh had just arrived from San Francisco, having accompanied the ambulance with Reiko. He'd volunteered for this assignment, though he couldn't quite explain why. Maybe because saving that woman in slave had cracked something open in his chest. Maybe because he wanted to see if this feeling, this sense that he'd done something truly good, would last. Or maybe because he was tired of hating, tired of carrying the weight of his best friend's death like a stone in his gut. The women were led, not dragged, to a large warehouse that had been converted into a processing center. Inside, the space was divided by canvas curtains into different sections. Signs hung from the ceiling in both English and Japanese. Registration, medical, supplies, quarters. The effort to communicate in their language was small, but it was noticed. Yuki stared at the Japanese characters, perfect and clear, hanging above American heads. They learned our language, she thought. Why would they do that unless they actually wanted us to understand? Aiko saw the same signs and felt her suspicion deepen. This is how they control us, she thought. Make us think they care. Make us compliant. Then the real torture begins. First came the paperwork. Each woman was asked her name, age, where she had been captured, what her role had been during the war. The questions were clinical, not accusatory. A female clerk sat behind a desk and recorded their answers with patient efficiency. She did not sneer or insult. She simply wrote, occasionally looking up to offer a brief professional smile. Then came the medical examinations, and this was where the women expected the horror to begin. They were separated into smaller groups and led behind curtains where female American nurses waited. Not male soldiers. Female nurses in crisp white uniforms with Red Cross armbands. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez was 38 years old, from San Antonio, Texas. She had joined the Army Nurse Corps 3 years ago after her fiancé died at the Bataan Death March. She had spent those 3 years treating American soldiers torn apart by Japanese bullets and bombs. She had held dying men who cursed the Japanese with their last breaths. She had every reason to be cruel to the women standing before her now. But Lieutenant Martinez had also taken an oath. And she had been raised by a mother who believed that healing was holy work, that nurses served God before they served nations. Yuki went first, her hands trembling, as she was asked to remove her soiled uniform. She had prepared herself for humiliation for violation. Instead, Martinez handed her a cotton robe and turned away to give her privacy. Privacy. The concept was so foreign after months of living in crowded barracks and ship holds that Yuki almost didn't understand the gesture. The examination was thorough but gentle. Martinez checked her eyes, ears, throat, listened to her heart and lungs, asked through Yamada about any injuries or illnesses. When she discovered lice in Yuki's hair, she did not recoil in disgust. She simply made a note on her chart and explained that they would provide treatment. Delousing is standard procedure, Yamada translated. Everyone goes through it. It's for your health and the health of others. You'll also receive clean clothes, food, and a place to sleep tonight. Tomorrow you'll be transported to a more permanent facility. One by one, the women went through the same process. Some were found to have untreated wounds like Reiko. Others had infections, malnutrition, signs of diseases like malaria or dysentery that had run rampant in the Pacific Islands. Every condition was noted. Every condition would be treated. The nurses moved with practiced efficiency, but also with something the women had not expected: respect. Fumiko watched the American medical procedures with professional interest. She recognized the protocols, the cleanliness, the organization. These were not battlefield conditions. This was a proper medical facility, even if temporary. The Americans had brought real supplies, real medicine, real training to bear on the problem of sick prisoners. When it was her turn to be examined, Fumiko submitted to the process with quiet dignity. The American nurse who checked her was older, probably in her 40s, with gray streaks in her brown hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She worked quickly but carefully, and when she finished, she did something unexpected. She placed a hand on Fumiko's shoulder and said through Yamada, "You're going to be okay now. All of you. We'll take care of you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Fumiko had not anticipated. Her throat tightened. She nodded once, unable to speak, and the nurse smiled before moving on to the next patient. Aiko's examination was different. She refused to make eye contact, answered questions with single syllables, radiated hostility like heat from a furnace. The nurse who examined her, a younger woman named Lieutenant Chen, worked with professional detachment, neither warm nor cold, simply doing her job. When it was over, Chen said through Yamada, "You have a vitamin deficiency and signs of malnutrition. We'll provide supplements and monitor your diet. You'll feel better soon." "I don't want to feel better," Aiko said in Japanese, her voice low and hard. "I want to go home. Or die. I don't care which." Yamada hesitated before translating. When he did, Chen's expression softened slightly. "I understand," she said quietly. "But while you're here, we're going to take care of you, whether you want us to or not." After the medical examinations came the part the women had truly dreaded. They were led to a separate building, a long wooden structure with pipes running along the ceiling and drains in the floor. A shower facility. This, they had been told, was where prisoners were degraded, stripped of dignity, made to suffer. But when they entered, they found something entirely different. The room was divided into private stalls, each with a curtain that could be pulled closed. Hooks on the walls held fresh towels, thick and white and clean. On a bench sat stacks of clothing, simple but new: cotton shirts, pants, underwear, socks. And beside each stack was a bar of soap, real soap. Not the gritty, caustic stuff they had occasionally been given during the war. This was smooth white soap that smelled faintly of lavender. The women picked up the bars and turned them over in their hands as if they were precious gems. Some had not seen real soap in over a year. An American woman, probably a volunteer from the Red Cross based on her armband, demonstrated how to use the showers through Yamada. Hot water was available. They could take as long as they needed. No one would rush them. No one would watch. The delousing powder would be provided after they finished washing, along with a special shampoo for their hair. Yuki went first again, more out of nervous energy than of bravery. She stepped into a stall, pulled the curtain closed, and stood for a moment in the small private space, trying to comprehend what was happening. Then she turned the knob labeled H as the woman had shown her. Hot water poured from the shower head, steaming and perfect. Yuki gasped, then began to cry. She couldn't help it. The water ran over her skin, washing away weeks of grime, salt, blood, and fear. She picked up the soap and lathered it between her hands, the scent of lavender filling her nose. And for the first time in months, she felt almost human again. Around her in other stalls, similar scenes unfolded. Women wept under the hot water, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of being clean. Others laughed in disbelief, unable to reconcile this experience with the horrors they had anticipated. The sound of running water mixed with voices, creating a strange symphony of relief and confusion. In her stall, Aiko stood under the water and felt nothing. No relief, no gratitude, only a deep, aching emptiness. Her children were dead. Her husband was gone. And she was here in enemy territory, being offered soap and hot water like some kind of gift she hadn't earned and didn't want. She scrubbed her skin raw, trying to wash away more than dirt, trying to wash away the guilt of surviving when her babies hadn't. trying to wash away the shame of accepting kindness from the people who had burned her city. When they emerged wrapped in thick towels, they were given the delousing powder and new clothes. The transformation was immediate. They looked at each other with wide eyes, hardly recognizing their companions. Clean hair, clean skin, clean clothes. They looked like people again. Not prisoners, not ghosts. Fumiko stood in front of a small mirror mounted on the wall, staring at her reflection. She had expected to see an old woman broken by war. Instead, she saw someone who looked merely tired, someone who might yet recover. The soap sat in her hand, a small white rectangle that had somehow become a symbol of something larger, of care, of humanity, of a kindness she had not expected to find in enemy hands. That evening, they were taken to a mess hall, a large room filled with tables and benches. The smell hit them before they even entered. Food. Real food. Not the thin gruel that had survived on for weeks, but actual cooked meals. The women filed in quietly, still uncertain, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. American soldiers sat at their own tables, eating and talking, barely glancing at the Japanese prisoners. There was no segregation, no special area designed to humiliate or isolate. The prisoners were simply directed to a serving line where food was being distributed. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez watched from the kitchen as the women entered. He was 35 years old, from El Paso, Texas, a career soldier who had spent the last 3 years managing mess operations across the Pacific. He had cooked for thousands of American soldiers, had stretched rations during shortages, had made meals from whatever supplies the Army could scrounge. Now he stood with his arms crossed, watching Japanese prisoners receive trays of food he had prepared with the same care he used for American troops. His assistant cook, a young private fresh from training, approached him with a question that Rodriguez had been expecting. "Sarge, the quartermaster says we're spending too much on prisoner rations. Says we should cut back, save money. They're just POWs, right?" Rodriguez turned to look at the kid, his expression hard as granite. "Son, let me tell you something. I don't care if they're POWs, refugees, or the Emperor himself. When someone sits at my table, they eat. We're the United States of America. We're the richest nation on earth. We can afford to feed prisoners properly, and by God we will. Anyone says different, you send them to me." The private nodded quickly and retreated to the kitchen. Rodriguez turned back to watch the women. One of them, the young one with the short hair, was eating her oatmeal with her eyes closed, savoring each bite. It reminded him of his own daughter, about the same age back home in Texas. The thought made his chest tight. On each tray, rice white and fluffy, not the brown, broken grains they had grown accustomed to. Vegetables green and orange steaming, meat at actual meat, not mystery protein from cans, bread soft and warm, a cup of milk, an orange. The women stared at their trays as if they were hallucinations. Yuki picked up her fork and just held it, looking at the food, afraid to eat. What if it was poisoned? What if this was a trick? But her stomach betrayed her, growling loudly in the quiet moment. Around her, other women were having the same internal debate. Then Fumiko, practical as always, took the first bite. She chewed slowly, her expression unreadable. The other women watched her, waiting for some sign of distress. Instead, Fumiko's eyes closed and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Not from poison, from taste, from the simple, overwhelming reality of real food after so long without it. That was all the permission the others needed. They began to eat slowly at first, then with increasing speed, as their bodies remembered what it meant to be fed. Some cried, others ate in focused silence. A few laughed in disbelief between bites, unable to contain the absurdity of the situation. The orange was the hardest part. Yuki held hers in both hands, turning it over, feeling the texture of the peel. She had not seen fresh fruit since before the war. Oranges were luxuries, treats saved for special occasions. Now she had one on her tray, given to her by the enemy in a mess hall in America. The contradiction was almost too much to bear. She peeled it slowly, the citrus scent exploding into the air. The first bite was sweet, almost painfully so. After months of bland food, the juice ran down her chin and she didn't care. From the kitchen doorway, Rodriguez watched Yuki eat the orange with her eyes closed, savoring every bite, and nodded to himself. This, he thought, this is what food is supposed to do. Remind people they're human. Across the table, another woman whispered in Japanese, "How can they have so much? We were told America was struggling, that they were desperate, that they were weak." But this, she gestured at her tray. This is not weakness. This is power. They have so much they can give it away. The words spread through the table like ripples in water. It was true. Everything they had been told about America, about the enemy, about the war itself was beginning to unravel with every bite of food, every bar of soap, every gesture of basic human decency. Aiko ate mechanically, tasting nothing. The food was there, so she ate it. Her body needed fuel to survive, so she provided it. But she felt no gratitude, no wonder, no relief. Only the hollow ache of knowing that somewhere in Tokyo people were starving. Her neighbors, her friends, maybe even relatives she didn't know were still alive. And she was here eating oranges. The guilt was crushing. In a hospital room across the city, Reiko Tanaka lay in a clean bed, intravenous lines running into her arms, monitors beeping softly beside her. Captain Hayes had operated for 4 hours, cleaning the infection, repairing the damage, saving her life. Now he sat in his office, writing notes in her chart, exhausted but satisfied. She would live. The infection had been severe. Sepsis had begun, but they had caught it in time. Penicillin, real penicillin, not the fake substitutes the Japanese had used in their field hospitals. Modern surgical technique, clean facilities. She had every advantage. A nurse knocked on his door. "The Japanese woman is awake, sir. She's asking for you." Hayes walked to her room, found Reiko staring at the ceiling, her face wet with silent tears. "Help me understand," she whispered in English when she saw him. "Why did you save me?" Hayes pulled up a chair, sat beside her bed. "Because that's what doctors do," he said simply. "And that's what Americans do. We see someone suffering, we help. Doesn't matter who they are." Reiko closed her eyes, more emotion welling up. "I thought you would let me die. I wanted to die. I thought death would be better than whatever you would do to me." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "I've fought at Guadalcanal," he said finally. "I've seen what this war did to people on both sides. I've seen cruelty. I've seen hatred. But I also took an oath. First, do no harm. That oath doesn't have exceptions for nationality." He stood, checked her IV, adjusted her blanket. "You're going to be okay, Miss Tanaka. You'll recover here, then join the others at the facility. And when you go home to Japan, I hope you'll remember that even in war, some people still choose mercy." Back at the warehouse processing center, the 36 women prepared for sleep. They had been assigned cots with real mattresses, real pillows, real blankets. After sleeping on the floor of a ship's hold for 3 weeks, it felt like luxury. Yuki lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Her belly was full for the first time in weeks. Her skin was clean. She wore clothes that didn't stink of sweat and fear. And yet she felt more confused than she had felt in her entire life. "Everything we were told was a lie," someone whispered in the darkness. "Not everything," another voice responded. "They did drop the atomic bombs. They did burn our cities. But they gave us soap," a third voice said, "and oranges, and hot water, and medicine. How can both be true?" No one had an answer. Fumiko, lying on her own cot, thought about the nurse who had told her everything would be okay. Thought about the professionalism, the cleanliness, the care. Thought about how these same people had waged brutal war against Japan and now treated Japanese prisoners with a dignity that Japan had rarely shown its own people, let alone its enemies. "It's not that they treat us well," Fumiko said quietly into the darkness. "It's that they have so much even caring for their enemies doesn't strain their resources. America was never bombed. Their factories kept running. Their farms kept producing. They won the war not just with weapons, but with sheer overwhelming abundance. This camp, this food, this medicine, it's nothing to them. A drop in an ocean." The observation was clinical, but it carried a painful truth. Japan had fought with everything it had, scraping together resources, rationing rice to the point of starvation, sending young men to date for an empire that could not even feed its own people. America had fought with one hand tied behind its back, never truly threatened on its own soil, never forced to sacrifice the way Japan had sacrificed. In another part of the facility, Private Joseph Dixon sat outside on guard duty smoking a cigarette, thinking about his brother. Jimmy had been 20 years old when he died on Saipan. Same island these women had come from. Same battle. Dixon had requested this assignment because he thought it would give him some kind of closure. See the enemy up close. Confirm they were as monstrous as he imagined. But tonight, watching through the warehouse windows as the women settled into their cots, all he saw were exhausted human beings. Women who looked like his mother, his sister, his aunt. Women who looked scared and confused and grateful for something as simple as a blanket. It made him angry, not at them, at himself, because hating was easier when the enemy didn't look human. Beside him, Sergeant Miller stood silent, his own cigarette burning down to nothing between his fingers. Miller was thinking the same thoughts, fighting the same internal battle. His brother David had always been the idealistic one, the one who believed America stood for something bigger than conquest. David would have wanted him to treat these women with dignity, but David was dead, killed by Japanese soldiers, and Miller didn't know if he had the strength to be the man his brother had believed he could be. Inside the warehouse, Yuki finally fell asleep, clutching her mother's photograph. Her last thought before dreams took her a simple question that would echo through the months to come. If they are this kind to enemies, what are they like to friends? In her cot, Aiko lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had seen American kindness today, witnessed it with her own eyes. The soap, the food, the medical care, and she hated them for it. Because kindness was harder to fight than cruelty. Kindness made you question everything you believed. Kindness made you wonder if your children had died for a lie. And that thought was unbearable. The answer to that question would change everything. The next morning arrived with a wake-up bell at 6 o'clock, a sound that would become familiar over the coming weeks. The women rose from their cots, still disoriented by the comfort of having slept on actual mattresses, still uncertain whether yesterday had been real or some fever dream conjured by exhaustion and fear. But the clean clothes they wore were real. The faint scent of lavender soap still lingered on their skin. And when they filed into the mess hall for breakfast, the food was real too. Oatmeal with brown sugar toast with butter coffee and orange juice. More food than some of them had seen in months. After breakfast, the women were loaded onto buses for transport to their permanent facility, a prisoner of war camp 2 hours north in the California countryside. The buses were clean with actual seats, windows that opened to let in fresh air. Not cattle cars, not cargo trucks, buses. As they drove through San Francisco, Yuki pressed her face to the window, staring at a world that seemed impossible. Buildings stood intact, undamaged. Cars moved along streets with no bomb craters. People walked on sidewalks, carrying shopping bags, talking, laughing. Children played in a park. There was no war here. The war had never touched this place. She thought of Tokyo, of Manila, of every city she had seen in the last 3 years. All of them scarred, burned, broken. And here was America untouched, thriving so abundant that even its enemies ate oranges. Aiko saw the same sights and felt her rage deepen. While Japan's starved America prospered. While Japanese children dug through rubble for scraps, American children played in parks. The injustice of it burned in her throat like bile. The camp, when they arrived, was surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers as expected. But inside, the grounds were surprisingly organized. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows painted white with numbers on the doors. Gardens grew between the buildings tended by earlier groups of prisoners. A recreation yard held benches and tables. There was even a small library. The women were assigned to Barracks 7, a long building with rows of beds, each with a mattress, pillow, and 2 blankets. Each woman had her own bed, her own space. Privacy curtains could be hung between the bunks for those who wanted them. A schedule was posted on the wall in both Japanese and English. 6 o'clock wake-up, 6:30 breakfast, 7:30 roll call, 8 o'clock work assignments, noon lunch, afternoon free time, 6 o'clock dinner, 10 o'clock lights out. It was regimented but not cruel. It was simply order, the kind of structure that military life had always followed. Corporal James Walsh stood outside Barracks 7, assigned to morning guard duty. He had not slept well the night before. Kept seeing that Japanese woman's blood on the dock, kept hearing her whisper in English, kept thinking about how close she had come to dying and how desperately Captain Hayes had worked to save her. Beside him on patrol was Sergeant Miller, who had been assigned to the same shift. Miller was young for his rank, only 20, but he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen too much too soon. "You ever think about why we're doing this?" Miller asked quietly as they walked the perimeter. "Treating them this well, I mean." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Orders," he said finally. "Colonel's orders." Miller shook his head. "It's more than that. It has to be. Otherwise, what's the point?" Inside the barracks, the women gathered around Fumiko, who had been quietly observing everything since their arrival. The older nurse had a way of seeing things clearly, of cutting through emotion to find practical truth. "What do you think?" Yuki asked her. "Is this real, Will? They keep treating us this way?" Fumiko was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I think they mean it," she said finally. "Everything I've seen, the medical facilities, the cleanliness, the protocols, it's all consistent with what the Geneva Convention requires. But more than that, it seems to be who they are. They're not doing the minimum. They're doing it properly. It's a trick," Aiko said sharply from her bunk. "Make us comfortable. Make us grateful. Then use us for propaganda. Or worse." Fumiko looked at the younger woman with compassion. "Perhaps," she said gently, "but if so, it's an elaborate trick. And I've been a nurse for 20 years. I know the difference between performance and genuine care. What I saw yesterday was genuine." Aiko turned away, her jaw tight. "You're naive," she muttered. "All of you are." In another part of the camp, Colonel Patterson sat in his office with Captain Hayes, who had driven up from San Francisco to check on Reiko's transfer. She would remain at Letterman Hospital for another 3 weeks at least, recovering from surgery and the infection that had nearly killed her. "How is she?" Patterson asked. "She'll live," Hayes said, "but she keeps asking why. Why we saved her. Why we're treating them well. She can't reconcile it with what she was taught about Americans." Patterson nodded slowly, lighting a cigarette. "I've been thinking about that, about what we're doing here. Got a call from intelligence this morning. They want to use these women for propaganda. Put out newsreels showing how well we treat POWs. Make Japan look bad in comparison." "What did you tell them?" Hayes asked. Patterson blew out smoke, his expression hard. "Told them no, we're not doing the right thing for propaganda value. We're doing it because it's right. The moment we start using these women for political gain, we become exactly what they accused us of being." Hayes smiled slightly. "I imagine they didn't like that answer." "They did not," Patterson confirmed. "But here's what I told them. These 37 women are witnesses, not propaganda tools. Witnesses. When they go home, they'll tell their stories. And those stories will be more powerful than any newsreel we could produce, because they'll be true." There was a knock at the door. A young corporal entered, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, there's a situation in the yard. One of the prisoners is refusing to work. Says she won't collaborate with the enemy." Patterson and Hayes exchanged glances. "Show me," Patterson said. They found Aiko standing in the middle of the recreation yard, and arms crossed, surrounded by a small crowd of confused guards and prisoners. Sergeant Miller stood nearby, trying to reason with her through Yamada's translation. "Ma'am, you're not collaborating," Miller was saying, his voice patient but firm. "The Geneva Convention requires that we provide work opportunities and compensate prisoners for their labor. It's not collaboration. It's international law." Yamada translated, but Aiko's expression didn't change. "I won't pretend this is acceptable," she said in Japanese. "I won't smile and bow and act grateful for being imprisoned by the people who murdered my children." The words hit Miller like a physical blow. He'd known intellectually that these women had losses too, but hearing it said so plainly, so full of raw pain, made it real in a way statistics never could. Patterson stepped forward. "What's her name?" he asked Yamada. "Aiko Nakamura, school teacher from Tokyo. Lost her 2 children in the March firebombing. Husband missing, presumed dead." Patterson absorbed this information, his expression softening slightly. "Tell her she doesn't have to work if she doesn't want to. Tell her we're not going to force her, but also tell her this: I lost my nephew at Normandy. 20 years old, good kid, smart, wanted to be a teacher actually, and I'm still here doing my job, trying to make sure his death meant something, trying to prove that America is worth what he paid for it." Yamada translated carefully. Aiko listened, her face unreadable. "Your nephew died fighting for his country," she said finally. "My children died because your country dropped fire from the sky on civilians. It's not the same." "No," Patterson agreed through Yamada. "It's not the same. War is never fair, never equal. But here's what I can control: how I treat you. And I choose to treat you with dignity, not because you've earned it, not because I think you deserve it, but because I believe that's what separates civilization from barbarism. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to be grateful. But you're going to receive it anyway." He turned to Miller. "Give her space. Let her process. She'll come around or she won't. Either way, we maintain standards. As Patterson walked away, Miller found himself still standing there looking at Aiko, seeing not an enemy, but a mother who had lost everything. His own brother's death felt fresh again, raw and painful. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, even though she couldn't understand him without Yamada translating. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about your children," Yamada translated. Aiko's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face before the mask of anger slammed back down. She turned and walked back to the barracks without another word. The weeks turned into months. By late November, the routines of camp life had become deeply familiar. The women had been in captivity for 3 months, and the contradictions were becoming harder to bear. Work assignments were distributed. Some women were assigned to the kitchen, helping prepare meals. Others worked in the laundry, washing uniforms and linens. A few, including Fumiko, were asked to assist in the camp infirmary. Their medical training made them valuable even as prisoners. Aiko eventually accepted a work assignment, not because she'd softened, but because the boredom of sitting alone in the barracks was worse than her pride. She worked in the library shelving books, her movements mechanical, her expression permanently set in stone. But what shocked the women most was the compensation. They were paid, actual money though, in camp scrip that could only be used in the camp canteen. The amounts were small, a few dollars per week, but the principle was staggering. They were prisoners, yet they were being paid for their labor. The Geneva Convention requires it, Sergeant Yamada explained for the 100th time. But the concept still seemed impossible. The canteen was another revelation. A small store where prisoners could buy cigarettes, chocolate soap, writing paper, stamps, even magazines. The prices were low, affordable with their wages. Yuki bought a chocolate bar on her 3rd week, spending her first earned dollar on something frivolous, something sweet. She ate it slowly, making it last, marveling at the taste of real chocolate after years of deprivation. Letters were allowed, though they were censored. The women could write home to Japan, send word to their families that they were alive, that they were being treated well. Some hesitated, unsure if they should admit the truth about their conditions. Would their families believe them? Would the government intercept the letters and accuse them of collaboration? But the desire to communicate was stronger than the fear. Yuki wrote to her mother, "I am alive. I am in America. I am being treated according to the Geneva Convention. Please do not worry. I hope you are safe. I hope Japan is rebuilding. I do not know when I will return, but I am alive." She did not mention the soap, the food, the abundance. Some things were too complicated to explain in a censored letter. Private Dixon found himself assigned to guard duty more often than he liked. He had requested a transfer, told his sergeant he didn't want to work with the Japanese prisoners, but his request had been denied. "You need to be here," his sergeant had said, "for your own good." Dixon didn't understand what that meant until the morning he saw one of the women trip on a loose board in the pathway. She fell hard, scraping her knee badly enough to draw blood. Before he could think, before he could remember he was supposed to hate her, Dixon was moving. He helped her up, radioed for the medic, his concern genuine and immediate. "You okay?" he asked. "Hurt bad," the woman. Yuki looked up at him with wide, surprised eyes. She recognized him as the guard who always looked angry, who never smiled, who seemed to radiate resentment. "Small," she said in careful English, one of the few words she knew. "Small hurt." Dixon found himself smiling despite everything. "Good," he said. "Small hurt, better than big hurt." The medic arrived, treated her knee, and Dixon went back to his post. But something had shifted. He had helped her without thinking, had reacted to her pain as he would react to any human being in pain. And that realization disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. That evening, Miller found Dixon sitting alone in the guard barracks, staring at his brother's baseball, the one Jimmy had carried through basic training and into combat, the one that had been mailed home with his personal effects. "You ever think," Dixon said without preamble, "that maybe Jimmy would want us to be better than this, better than hate?" Miller looked at his friend, saw the struggle written plain on his face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think about it all the time. My brother David, he was the good one. Always talking about making the world better, about America, being a force for good. I used to think it was naive, but now," he trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward the barracks where the women slept. "Now I think maybe he was right." Miller finished, "Maybe the real victory isn't killing the enemy. It's proving we're better than the worst things we had to do to win." Dixon turned the baseball over in his hands, feeling the worn leather, the faded signature. "What are we supposed to do with this feeling?" he asked. "This not knowing if we're doing the right thing or being weak." "I don't know," Miller admitted. But I think we keep showing up, keep doing our buns, keep treating them like people, and hope that means something. In the camp library, a small room with donated books and magazines, Mrs. Dorothy Peterson shelved returned materials and prepared new displays. She was 55 years old, a civilian volunteer who had lost her only son in the Pacific War. Thomas had died at Guadalcanal in 1943, 22 years old, full of promise and dreams. When the camp had requested volunteers to help run the library for prisoners, most people in town had refused. Why help the enemy? Why make their captivity comfortable? But Dorothy had volunteered immediately, not because she had forgiven, she would never forgive the war that took her son, but because Thomas had believed in something. He had believed America was worth dying for. And if she let hatred turn her into someone cruel, someone who denied basic dignity to prisoners, then what had he died for? The door opened and several Japanese women entered, hesitant, uncertain. They had been told the library was open to them, but they hadn't quite believed it. Dorothy smiled at them, gestured to the shelves. "Take your time," she said through Yamada, who had come to help translate. "We have books in Japanese and English learning materials if you are interested." One of the women, Yuki, approached the English language section with obvious interest. Dorothy helped her select a basic grammar book and a simple reader. "You want to learn English?" Dorothy asked. Yuki nodded. "Want to understand," she said carefully, the words clearly practiced. Dorothy felt her throat tighten with emotion. Her son had died fighting these people. And now here she was helping one of them learn English, seeing in this young woman's face the same eagerness to learn that Thomas had always shown. It hurt, but it also felt right, like honoring his memory by being better than the war had tried to make her. "Come back any time," Dorothy said. "I'll help you." Aiko watched this exchange from across the library, her expression cold. She had been assigned here, forced to work alongside this American woman who smiled and offered help like there was no blood between their nations. It made her sick, but it also made her curious in a way she hated herself for. Why would this woman who had lost her son choose kindness over revenge? The question haunted her through the following days and weeks, even as she refused to speak to Mrs. Peterson, refused to acknowledge her kindness, refused to let down her guard even for a moment. The routine became familiar. Wake, eat, work, rest, eat, sleep. It was monotonous, but it was also safe. No bombs fell, no soldiers threatened them. The guards were firm but not violent. They kept order, enforced rules, but they did not abuse their power. And slowly, subtly, the contradiction gnawed at the women. They had been told Americans were demons. But demons did not serve hot meals 3 times a day. Demons did not provide medical care and clean clothes and libraries. Demons did not pay wages and respect privacy and smile at prisoners. Either everything they had been told was a lie, or these Americans were not actually Americans, but some strange aberration. Fumiko knew which option was true. She had seen too much, observed too carefully to deny reality any longer. These Americans were exactly what Americans claimed to be. People who genuinely believed that human dignity mattered even in war. It was terrifying in its implications. Because if America had these values and Japan did not, what did that say about everything she had believed about her country, her culture, her civilization? Late at night when the barracks were dark and the women whispered to each other, these questions emerged like wounds that would not heal. "We were lied to," one woman said, her voice breaking. "About everything." "Not everything," another responded. "They did burn our cities. They did kill our people. But we killed theirs too," a third voice added. "And now look how they treat us. Would we have treated American prisoners this way?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Fumiko lay in her bunk, thinking about the nurse who had examined her that first day, thinking about the kindness in her eyes, the competence in her hands, thinking about how that same kindness and competence was being applied to enemy prisoners without hesitation, without cruelty, without the need to dehumanize in order to cope. "It's not that they're better than us," Fumiko whispered into the darkness. "It's that they believe different things. They believe individual human life has value regardless of nationality. They believe their values are worth maintaining even when it costs them, even when it would be easier not to." And maybe she thought, but did not say aloud, maybe that's why they won. In the infirmary where Fumiko worked 3 days a week, she learned modern medical techniques that Japan had never taught her. proper sterilization protocols, efficient triage systems, the use of penicillin and other antibiotics that had been scarce or non-existent in Japanese field hospitals. The camp doctor, Captain Margaret Sullivan, treated Fumiko not as a prisoner, but as a colleague. She explained procedures, asked for Fumiko's input, respected her experience, even while teaching her new methods. One afternoon, while they were treating a prisoner who had developed pneumonia, Sullivan handed Fumiko the penicillin injection. "You administer it," she said. "You know how." Fumiko took the syringe, her hand steady despite her surprise. In Japan, she would never have been trusted with such valuable medicine, would never have been given this responsibility. But Sullivan was looking at her with complete confidence, treating her as an equal. The injection went smoothly. The patient's fever began to drop within hours, and Fumiko felt something shift inside herself, something she couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or purpose, or simply the recognition that competence and dignity transcended national boundaries. "Thank you for trusting me," she said to Sullivan later. Sullivan looked surprised. "Why wouldn't I trust you? You're a trained nurse, probably more experienced than me in field conditions. I'd be stupid not to use your expertise." It was such a simple statement, such an obvious truth, but it represented a worldview so different from what Fumiko had known that it made her want to weep. In Japan, she had been valuable because of her service to the state. Here she was valuable because of her humanity, her skills, her individual worth. The difference was everything. Yuki's English improved steadily. She studied every day, practiced with the few English speakers in camp, read simple books from the library. Mrs. Peterson helped her patiently, correcting pronunciation, explaining grammar, sharing the language as a gift rather than a weapon. One day, as Yuki was leaving the library, she worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind for weeks. "Mrs. Peterson," she said slowly, carefully, "your son died in the war, Japan. Why you help me? Why you kind?" Dorothy Peterson stopped what she was doing, looked at this young woman who was trying so hard to understand, to bridge a gap that war had torn open. From across the room, Aiko watched her expression unreadable. Because Dorothy said quietly, "My son believed America was worth dying for. He believed in freedom, in dignity, in treating people right even when it's hard. If I hate you because of where you were born, then he died for nothing. But if I can teach you English, help you learn, show you kindness even though it hurts, then maybe he died for something beautiful." Yuki's eyes glistened with emotion. She bowed deeply, the traditional Japanese gesture of profound respect and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I remember. Always remember." Dorothy nodded, her own eyes wet. "That's all I ask." Aiko turned away, her hands shaking as she shelved books with unnecessary force. She had heard every word, understood the implication. This woman had lost her son and chosen kindness over hatred. And Aiko, who had lost her children and chosen only bitterness, suddenly felt something crack in the armor she had built around her heart. She pushed it down, refused to feel it, went back to work with her jaw clenched and her eyes dry and her heart screaming. As December approached, the camp began preparing for Christmas. The American soldiers decorated a tree in the mess hall, hung lights and ornaments, played carols over the loudspeaker system. The Japanese women watched with confusion and curiosity. They did not understand this Christian holiday, but they were invited to participate. A special Christmas dinner was planned: turkey stuffing, cranberry sauce pies. The most elaborate meal the prisoners would see during their entire captivity. But behind the scenes, Colonel Patterson was fighting a battle of his own. Headquarters had sent word that budget cuts were being proposed. The camp was spending too much on prisoner care. Food costs were too high, medical expenses excessive, entertainment unnecessary. Patterson sat in his office reading the memo for the third time, his anger building with each word. He picked up the phone and called his superior officer. "Sir, with all due respect, I'm not implementing these cuts," Patterson said when the connection was made. "Every dollar we spend on these women demonstrates American values. It's worth more than any propaganda campaign we could run. It proves we mean what we say about human dignity." The voice on the other end was not sympathetic. "Colonel, I understand your position, but we have a budget. These are prisoners of war, not guests. We can provide adequate care without the extras." "Adequate," Patterson said, his voice hard, "is not the American standard. Excellence is. These women will go home and tell stories about their time here. I want those stories to reflect who we really are, not the bare minimum we could get away with. The conversation went back and forth for 20 minutes. In the end, Patterson got his way, but only by threatening to resign and go public with the reason why. When he hung up, he sat back in his chair exhausted. Captain Hayes, who had been waiting outside, entered. "Everything okay?" Hayes asked. Patterson lit a cigarette, his hand shaking slightly. "Bureaucrats," he said. "They don't understand that this—" He gestured toward the window, toward the barracks. "This is the real war. The war for what kind of country we're going to be after the fighting stops." Hayes nodded. "The Christmas feast is still on. The Christmas feast," Patterson confirmed, "is not negotiable. On Christmas Eve, Mrs. Peterson sat in her small apartment in town knitting. The scarf was almost finished, soft blue wool that she'd bought with her own money, worked on during every spare moment for the past month. She thought about Thomas as she knitted. Remembered teaching him to ice skate when he was 7. Remembered his high school graduation. Remembered the day he left for the war, so young and brave and certain he was doing the right thing. And she thought about the Japanese woman in the library. Iko, the one who shelved books with such careful precision, who never smiled, who radiated pain like heat from a coal. Yamada had told her Aiko's story. The children, the husband, the loss. Dorothy's hands moved automatically, knitting stitch after stitch, and tears ran down her face unchecked. 2 mothers, she thought. 2 losses. 2 nations. And somehow I have to find a way to bridge that gap. For Thomas. For his memory. The next morning, she approached Yamada with a request. "I've made something," she said, holding up the hand-knitted scarf. "It's for Aiko, the woman who lost her children. I'd like to give it to her." Yamada looked at the scarf, then at Dorothy, his expression a mixture of surprise and deep respect. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "She's been difficult." "I'm sure," Dorothy said. "She's a mother who lost her children. I'm a mother who lost her child. We speak the same language, even if she doesn't know it yet." Christmas morning arrived with fog and cold rain, typical California winter weather. But inside the mess hall, warmth and light greeted the prisoners. The Christmas tree stood decorated with handmade ornaments. The smell of roasting turkey filled the air. The women entered hesitantly, still unsure of their place in this strange celebration. But the American soldiers welcomed them, showed them to tables, served them plates piled high with food. Corporal Walsh found himself sitting near Yuki, who was staring at her plate with an expression of quiet amazement. "Merry Christmas," Walsh said. Yuki looked up after recognized him as the medic who had helped Reiko on the dock. "Merry Christmas," she repeated, carefully testing the unfamiliar words. "You speak English now," Walsh observed. "Little bit," Yuki said, smiling shyly. "Learning. Trying." "That's good," Walsh said. "That's real good." They ate in companionable silence, and Walsh thought about how strange it was to share a holiday meal with someone he had been prepared to see as an enemy just a few months ago. Sergeant Miller sat at another table watching the scene with something like wonder. His brother David would have loved this, he thought. Would have thought this was exactly what America should be about. In the kitchen, Rodriguez watched with satisfaction. This was what food was supposed to do. Bring people together, remind them of shared humanity. After the meal, as the women were preparing to return to their barracks, Yamada approached Aiko. "There's someone who wants to give you something," he said in Mormons. Aiko followed him reluctantly, her guard up, expecting some kind of trap or manipulation. Instead, she found Mrs. Peterson standing near the Christmas tree, holding a soft blue scarf. Dorothy stepped forward, the scarf in her hands, and through Yamada's translation spoke quietly. "I lost my son, Thomas, in this war. He was 22. He loved to read, wanted to be a teacher. He died believing America stood for something good, something worth dying for." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "I heard you lost your children. I can't imagine that pain. I lost one child and it nearly destroyed me. But I made this for you, mother to mother, because I think Thomas would want me to see you as a person, not an enemy. I think he'd want me to choose kindness over hatred." She held out the scarf. Aiko stared at it, her mind reeling. This woman, this American woman who had every reason to hate her, had made something beautiful with her own hands and was offering it as a gift. The scarf was soft and warm and clearly made with care hours of work while thinking about a stranger, an enemy, a woman whose country had killed her son. Something inside Aiko broke. She tried to hold it together, tried to maintain the armor of anger that had protected her for so long. But the kindness was too much. The gift was too pure. The gesture too genuine. She took the scarf with shaking hands, and then she shattered. The grief came out in great racking sobs. Not quiet crying, not dignified tears. She wept like a child, like a mother who had lost everything, like a woman who had been holding her pain so tightly it had turned to stone inside her. Mrs. Peterson stood frozen for a moment, uncertain. Then, moving on instinct, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Aiko. Two mothers, two losses, two nations at war, holding each other and crying for everything that had been taken and everything that might still be saved. The other women watched in silence, witnessing something they had no words to describe. Even the hardened soldiers looked away, giving the moment the privacy it deserved. Private Dixon, standing guard outside the building, heard the crying through the window. He stepped closer, saw the embrace, saw the scarf, understood, without needing translation, what was happening. He thought about his brother Jimmy, thought about how Jimmy had always been the kind one, the gentle one, the one who believed people were basically good if you gave them a chance to be. Jimmy would have loved this, Dixon thought, would have thought this was exactly what America should be doing. And for the first time since his brother's death, Dixon felt something other than anger. He felt something that might have been pride. Pride that his country, his America, had chosen this path, had chosen to be merciful when it could have been cruel. Beside him, Miller wiped his eyes quickly, hoping Dixon wouldn't notice. But Dixon had noticed, and he said nothing because he understood. Later that night, as they prepared for sleep, Fumiko wrapped herself in the blue scarf Mrs. Peterson had given to Aiko, who had insisted Fumiko try it on. It was not just a scarf. It was a symbol of everything they had learned in 4 months of captivity. That mercy was possible. That enemies could become human. That values mattered more than victories. And that America, for all its flaws and contradictions, had chosen to live up to its ideals when it would have been easier not to. But Aiko, lying in her bunk with the scarf folded carefully beside her pillow, felt something new, something she hadn't felt since her children died. Hope, fragile and painful and terrifying, but real. Maybe she thought, just maybe, kindness could still exist in a world this broken. Maybe that was what her children would have wanted her to believe. Late one evening in early January, the camp loudspeakers crackled to life with a Japanese language broadcast. The women gathered in the common area expecting news from home, perhaps updates about reconstruction efforts or messages from families. Instead, they heard a voice they recognized. Tokyo Rose, Japanese propaganda radio. The broadcast was aimed at POWs across America, but the message hit the women in Barracks 7 like a physical blow. Japanese prisoners living in comfort, while your families starve in ruins, the voice said, smooth and accusatory. Women who accepted enemy kindness instead of choosing honorable death. You sleep in warm beds while your children freeze. You eat American food while your mothers beg for rice. You have betrayed the emperor. You have forgotten what it means to be Japanese. You are traitors. The words continued, painting them as collaborators, as shameful examples of weakness, as women who had chosen survival over honor and deserved nothing but contempt when they returned home. When the broadcast finally ended, no one spoke for a long time. The silence in the barracks was suffocating. Finally, Fumiko broke it, her voice shaking but defiant. They call us traitors for accepting food, for not dying, for being treated according to international law. If that makes us traitors, then I choose treason over starvation. But even as she spoke, fear flickered across her face, because they all understood what this meant. When they returned to Japan, they would face more than ruins. They would face accusations, shame, suspicion. The very mercy that had saved them would be used against them. Aiko, who had been transformed by Mrs. Peterson's scarf, sat holding the blue wool in her hands. I spent months hating them for being kind, she said quietly. And now Tokyo calls me a traitor for accepting that kindness. Maybe both are true. Maybe I am a traitor to the Japan I knew, but that Japan killed my children with its lies. She looked around at the other women. I would rather be a traitor to that Japan than remain loyal to the hatred that destroyed everything I loved. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. 3 months had passed since the Tokyo Rose broadcast, and spring was beginning to touch the California hills with green. On a cool March morning, Reiko Tanaka returned to the camp. The women gathered around her in the barracks, touching her arms as if to confirm she was real. She looked different, healthy. Her skin had color. She had gained weight, and her belly, now 7 months swollen with child, announced a truth that took everyone's breath away. The baby's father died on Saipan, Reiko explained quietly. I didn't even know I was carrying his child until the American doctors told me. They've been taking care of us, both of us. Dr. Hayes says everything looks healthy, Reiko continued. He talks about this baby like it's his own grandchild. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. This baby, this innocent life, had become a symbol of everything the camp represented. Mercy in action, values made flesh. Private Dixon found himself volunteering for extra shifts near the infirmary where Reiko was housed. The baby hadn't chosen war, hadn't chosen sides. The baby was just innocent life, and Dixon had spent too many years seeing life destroyed to be anything but protective of it now. On May 8, 1946, at 2 in the morning, Reiko went into labor. Dr. Hayes was called from his quarters, arriving within 20 minutes. Dixon, who was on night guard duty, heard the commotion and found himself standing outside the infirmary, listening to the sounds of labor, praying without quite meaning to. God, he thought, don't let anything go wrong. Not this baby. Not on my watch. Jimmy would have wanted me to protect this life. Inside, Reiko struggled through 8 hours of labor. The baby's heart rate dropped suddenly during a contraction. Hayes made a quick decision, his hands moving with practiced precision. And then at 10:47 on the morning of May 8, 1946, a baby girl entered the world crying lustily, pink and perfect and alive. Outside, Dixon heard the baby's first cry and felt something break open in his chest. Relief, joy, hope, all mixed together. He had prayed for this baby, an enemy's baby, and God had answered. Thank you, he whispered to the morning sky. Jimmy, I think you'd be proud of this. Later that day, when the women were allowed to visit, they crowded around Reiko's bed. What will you name her, Yuki asked. Nozomi, Reiko said softly. It means hope. April arrived with the announcement that repatriation would begin in May. The women would be going home. Sergeant Miller approached Dixon one evening. I've been thinking, he said. We should do something for them before they leave. Dixon nodded slowly. I've been thinking the same thing. Over the next 2 weeks, Miller organized a quiet donation drive among the soldiers. Soap, chocolate, warm clothes, letters. Small things but meaningful. Dixon sat in his barracks holding his brother Jimmy's baseball. The leather was worn, the stitching frayed, Jimmy's signature faded but still visible. It was the last piece of his brother he had left. He thought about Jimmy, about what kind of man his brother had been, about what Jimmy would want him to do. The next morning, Dixon found Yuki in the library studying English with Mrs. Peterson. Can I talk to you, he asked. Outside, Yuki followed him nervously. Dixon pulled the baseball from his pocket. This was my brother's, he said slowly, knowing she wouldn't understand all the words, but hoping she'd understand the meaning. Jimmy. He died on Saipan, same place you were captured. He held out the baseball. I want you to have it, for your children someday. So they know that even in war, people tried to be human. Yuki stared at the baseball, then at Dixon, her eyes filling. She understood enough. She understood everything. She took the baseball with trembling hands, bowed deeply, and whispered in careful English. I remember. Always remember. Your brother. You. All of you. Dixon felt his throat tighten. Yeah, he said. That's all we can ask. On May 22nd, the 37 women boarded buses that would take them to the docks. Reiko held baby Nozomi carefully. Each woman carried a care package. Colonel Patterson made a brief speech. Ladies, you came here as prisoners of war. You leave as witnesses to what America believes about human dignity. That baby, he gestured to Nozomi, was born on American soil, delivered by American hands. She is living proof that even enemies deserve mercy. Tell her story. Mrs. Peterson approached Yuki one last time, pressing an envelope into her hands. My address, she said. Write to me when you can. Yuki hugged her fiercely. I will never forget you. Miller shook hands with several women. You take care, he said. Dixon stood awkwardly until Yuki approached him, holding up Jimmy's baseball. This true, she said in careful English, pointing to the ball. You teach me. Nobody enemy anymore. Just people. Just people, Dixon agreed, his voice thick. As the buses pulled away, Americans waved goodbye. The ship journey back took 3 weeks. When Tokyo Bay finally appeared on the horizon, what they saw took their breath away. Ruins, devastation. The city was a field of rubble and makeshift shelters. Yuki found her mother waiting at the dock, barely recognizable, skeletal wearing patched clothes. When they embraced, Yuki felt bones through thin fabric. "I'm sorry," Yuki whispered. "I'm so sorry I was safe while you suffered." Her mother pulled back, looked at her with fierce love. "You survived. That's all that matters." That night, Yuki gave her mother the bar of soap she had saved. Her mother held it like a treasure. "The Americans gave it to me," Yuki admitted. "They were kind." Her mother nodded. "Then we are grateful. In the middle of so much cruelty, kindness is a miracle." Yuki found work with the American occupation forces as a translator. She witnessed American generosity again and again. The same pattern, the same overwhelming abundance. Reiko became a teacher holding baby Nozomi on her hip between classes, telling anyone who asked about the American doctors who had saved both their lives. Years passed. The women scattered across Japan, each carrying the story. In 1950, a box arrived at Reiko's rebuilt school. Inside were textbooks carefully selected for different grade levels and a note from Captain Hayes. "Every child deserves to learn, even across oceans. For Nozomi, when she's ready." Reiko wept holding the note. In 1960, 15 years after the war ended, Reiko organized a reunion in Tokyo. 28 women gathered, older now, but still connected. And there were surprise guests. Colonel Patterson, now retired, had flown to Tokyo at his own expense. Dr. Hayes came with his wife. Corporal Walsh, now farming in Iowa. Sergeant Miller, who had saved for 2 years to make the trip. And Mrs. Peterson, silver-haired but still sharp-eyed. The reunion was emotional chaos. Embraces and laughter. Two groups of former enemies who had become something else. Yuki introduced her husband and 2 children to Walsh and Miller. "This is the man I told you about," she said in fluent English to Walsh. "And this," she turned to Miller, "is the man who taught me about forgiveness." Her younger son, 8 years old, was playing catch with another boy in the corner. The ball they were using was worn leather, faded stitching, and old American baseball. Miller froze when he saw it. He walked over slowly, picked up the ball, when the boy dropped it and read the faded signature. "Jimmy Dixon," it said, "Iowa, 1942. Miller's hands started shaking. "Where did you get this?" he asked through Yamada's translation. The boy looked confused. "My mother," he said. "An American soldier gave it to her." Miller looked at Yuki, his eyes wet. "Dixon gave you this?" "Yes," Yuki said quietly. "His brother's baseball. He said to give it to my children someday." Miller sat down hard on a bench, still holding the ball. "Dixon died," he said, his voice breaking. 1953. Tractor accident back home in Iowa. He never got to see this, never knew his brother's baseball made it to Japan. "Made it to your son," he looked at the boy. "But he'd love this. He'd love knowing that Jimmy's ball is still teaching kids about being human." Mrs. Peterson sat with Aiko and 14-year-old Nozomi. "You were just born when I last saw you," she said. "Now look at you." Nozomi spoke in careful English. "My mother told me about you, about your son. His memory lives in what you did, in who I became because of it." Mrs. Peterson wept openly. "Thank you," she whispered. Colonel Patterson stood and addressed the group. 15 years ago, we were enemies. But America made a choice. We chose to follow our values even when it was hard. This is why America fights. Not for territory, not for revenge. We fight so that one day people like us can stand together in peace. That's the victory that lasts," Patterson continued. "Not military victory, moral victory. The choice to be better than we had to be." In 1975, Nozomi, now 29, stood before the United Nations as a diplomat representing Japan. "I was born in August 1946 in a prisoner of war camp in California," she said. "I should not exist. My mother nearly died from an infected wound, but American doctors chose to save her, chose to save me. They could have chosen differently. They had the power, but they chose mercy." She paused. "I grew up hearing this story, and it taught me that nations like people are defined by their choices. America chose to be better, and that choice changed my country's understanding of what America means, changed my life, changed history." The applause was long and genuine. In 1998, Yuki Matsuda, now 72, sat in her Tokyo apartment with her 16-year-old granddaughter. There was a knock at the door. A woman in her 40s stood there holding an envelope. "I'm Sarah Miller," she said in English, which the granddaughter translated. Robert Miller's daughter. He passed away last month. He left this for you. Yuki opened the letter with shaking hands. Dear Yuki, it read, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But I wanted you to know something. You taught me that the real enemy isn't people, it's hate. My brother David died hating. I almost died hating too. But you and the other women you showed me that enemies are just people who haven't met yet. Dixon figured that out before I did. He was always smarter. I'm glad his brother's baseball found a home with your son. I'm glad it's still teaching kids to play together instead of fight. That's what David would have wanted. That's what all our brothers would have wanted. Thank you for that gift. Your friend always, Bob Miller. Yuki wept holding the letter. She showed her granddaughter the bar of soap still wrapped carefully preserved for 53 years. She showed her Jimmy's baseball kept in a place of honor. She showed her Dixon's note, Miller's letter, all the fragments of a story that had defined her life. These are symbols, Yuki explained. This soap represents a choice. America had the power to treat us cruelly. They chose mercy instead. She handed her granddaughter the soap. I've kept this for 53 years. Now I give it to you. Not because it's soap, because it's a reminder that values matter. Her granddaughter held the soap carefully. What do you want me to do with it? Remember, Yuki said. Just remember. Later that night, after her granddaughter had gone home, Yuki sat at her window looking out over modern Tokyo, rebuilt and thriving allied with America. She thought about all the Americans who had chosen day after day to live up to their values even when it was hard. And then the language her granddaughter was learning for her studies. Yuki whispered the words she had been saving. The he, Hayes Miller Patterson Hola Allah. Tehe vidai tuksu. Khomchi vi chintang chinchang ma vi chintang dumkat. The generation of Hayes Miller Patterson, they were the true greatest generation. Not just because they won the war, but because they won it the right way. The soap sat on her windowsill white and pristine after 5 decades, still faintly scented with lavender. And as Yuki closed her eyes to sleep for the last time, she smiled, grateful for the gift of a long life, grateful for the lesson of unexpected kindness, grateful that she had lived to see enemies become friends and hatred transform into hope. Tomorrow her granddaughter would carry the story forward. And maybe, just maybe, that story would echo through another generation, another century, reminding people that even in war, humanity can survive. Even in darkness, mercy can shine. Even between enemies, kindness can bridge the gap. That's what America chose to teach. That's what 37 Japanese women learned. That's what one bar of soap, one orange, one baseball, one act of mercy can mean. Everything.